So every episode, we meet with an architect or a community leader or an expert in the building and construction field to discuss issues about problems or how to make our current cities more healthy, equitable, sustainable, and how to secure a better future for our children and the next generations. Today, I'm meeting with Mike Maines. He's an industry expert, and he's a designer, architectural designer, and he's an expert in energy efficiency and passive house. He's writing a book, and I'm so excited to hear more about it. I'll let Mike introduce himself.
Okay.
Welcome. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. I will start by saying I have a lifelong struggle with stuttering, so I will freeze up occasionally. It's not Zoom, it's me. It's just the way I talk. But I just like to get it out of the way early because not everybody knows what's happening when my face just freezes. So that's we're all dealing with something, and that's my little cross to bear. And I'm thankful that it's not anything worse. So I grew up in Maine. I was away for 20 years for school and work, and my wife and I moved back just about 20 years ago. I have a degree in structural engineering and a minor in art history, and worked for 10 years as a carpenter. I've done a few other things, but for the last 7 years, I've been a self-employed residential designer. So I have kind of a broad background, and I'm a student of lots of things. I wouldn't say I'm an expert. I'm a student of energy efficiency and building science, and I like to share what I've learned with the world. I'm also a contributing editor at Fine Homebuilding Magazine, which is just a fancy title to mean that I write for them pretty regularly, usually about energy efficiency topics, but sometimes about design, sometimes, yeah, I guess that's it.
Thank you and welcome. So what drives that passion to energy efficiency and passive house and building science? I'm passionate about the building science too.
Yeah. No, I think for me, really, I've always been very interested in nature, in the environment. I spent lots of time outdoors. I spent lots of time outdoors as a kid. I grew up on a 100-acre farm with fields and woods and a river. So I was outside all the time. I love to hike, and I used to mountain bike a lot. I used to build and then design conventional houses, nice houses, good craftsmanship, good quality design, all of that. But as I learned more and more over time about the impact that our buildings have on the environment, I mean, between building them and operating them, our buildings are responsible for almost 40% of all greenhouse gas emissions, which is just a huge amount. So I feel directly responsible to try to reduce our buildings' impact on the environment. I'd love to be able to go to the extremes, but I also have a mortgage to pay, and there's a limit. So I sort of find myself in trying to help people do better. So I focus on single family homes, good quality, and I just push people to be as energy efficient and low carbon as they can. And then more recently, I've learned more and more about how important indoor air quality is. I mean, in the last year, we've all learned how important indoor air quality is, but it really has a big impact on occupant health and comfort. So I think that's another element of high performance design, whether it's passive house or other programs. The quality of the air is really directly correlates to people's health. So and then I also just leveled houses. I love traditional ways of building. I like knowing all the different ways houses go together. So to me, every design project is a big puzzle of figuring out what are all the elements and how do they fit together, and how can I push people to do better, not just on aesthetics, but on all fronts.
Why should people have passive houses? Why should people want to do more sustainable houses?
Yeah, well, I mean,
what would you tell them?
Yeah, with passive house specifically, I've worked at a passive house panelizing company. I'm a certified Passivhaus Consultant, and I think it's a great program. particularly when you're looking at energy efficiency and indoor air quality. Like I think that's where Passive House, it's a very comprehensive, very intensive, but very accurate, basically way of modeling how the building will perform. It includes energy modeling, but then it also includes a lot about indoor air quality. How often is the air turning over? What's the temperatures? So you end up with a house that uses very little energy. I mean, the Passive Houses I've been involved with are all single family, and they all use for all energy needs. They use less than $1,000 worth of energy a year, which is just incredibly cheap. When a conventional house, or the kinds of houses I work on, usually we're talking more like $5,000 to $10,000 a year in terms of energy operating costs. So I think getting the cost down for the homeowners is worthwhile. It's not always the best investment, but it's always a good investment.
It's always a good investment.
Yeah, well, I shouldn't say always. It's usually a good investment. There are diminishing returns, and so with my broader focus beyond Passive House, I think a common criticism of Passive House is that it's really good on energy and air quality, and it mostly only cares about energy and air quality. It doesn't care about embodied carbon. It doesn't care where you build. It doesn't care if you use local labor, natural versus synthetic materials. There are building durability aspects built into the Passive House program, but they're not guaranteed. So I like to use Passive House for what is best for, which is sort of, they have a very strong training program. Their energy modeling programs are extremely accurate. I think it's a great way to learn what you have to do. And I think getting a project certified occasionally is a good way to make sure you understand what's happening. But I also think it's important to take a step back and take a broader view, which you might do through like LEED. LEED is a pretty comprehensive program. It's criticized for being basically checkboxes, and you can offset something that would be common sense with something that's not common sense. And so it sort of dumbs down the whole idea, but it's pretty comprehensive and very good. Sort of, if you take that to the extreme, there's the Living Building Challenge put on by the Living Future Institute, which is extremely comprehensive. Basically, everything needs to be regenerative. So like on energy and air quality, they're equivalent to Passive House, but then they do the same thing for, how much water do you use, and where did your materials come from, and what's happening with your wastewater, and just it's extremely comprehensive and very challenging. So challenging that in the 10 or 15 years it's been around, there are now 2 houses in the US who are Living Building Challenge certified. So it's an awesome program, but it's a little too, it's appealing to those of us who are sort of on the front end of the curve, but it's not doing much for the vast majority of American houses that are pretty poorly performing. There are other programs that have various levels of comprehension. Is that the word? I don't know, but just, but one I've been involved with since the beginning is called the Pretty Good House approach. The idea is at a building science discussion group in Portland, Maine. The moderator, Dan Colbert, was building his second LEED certified house, and just found some of the things he was doing kind of silly, not common sense, unnecessarily expensive, etc. And so he just asked the group, like, if you forget about certifications, just what kind of house should we all be building? What would go into a good house? And so it was sort of an idea of crowdsourcing, like what is truly important. I mean, architects care about aesthetics and flow and function, and builders care about how fast and how well can you build it to avoid callbacks, and homeowners care about how much it costs. But we couldn't think of any programs that were really comprehensive. So we brainstormed ideas. I wrote a blog post for Green Building Advisor about it, which sort of announced the idea, and it sort of took on a life of its own. That was just about 10 years ago, and the idea has kicked around ever since. I think most green builders and architects in the U.S. have at least heard of it at this point, which is crazy for something that just started with a group of maybe 25 or 30 of us just chatting about for fun one evening. And with a pretty good house, it has a lot in common with passive house. Like, we want, excellent air tightness numbers. Passive House International, the one I'm trained in, calls for 0.6 air changes per hour at 50 pascals. With a pretty good house, we say 1 is good enough. Passive House gives you very strict energy targets. With pretty good house, we just say, here are some guidelines, but basically do your best. Don't go with code minimum. There's always a return on investment to go above code minimum numbers for your building envelope. But like in passive house, sometimes like with single family houses, I've done 12 inches of foam under slabs. I've done an R140 in the roof, just to try to hit those passive house numbers. And it doesn't make common. It doesn't pass the straight face test when you have to do those kinds of tricks. Like there's very little, like in terms of real world changes, like going from R60, which is what we recommend in climate zones 5 and 6, going from R60 to R140. It's like going from, 1.5 feet of insulation to 3 feet of insulation in your roof, and it might save you $10 a year. That might even be on the generous side. More insulation is always good, but there's a sort of limit to what makes sense. But there are other areas where passive house makes more sense. Like that's for most of my experience is relatively small homes, and I think passive house, at least the international passive house, small houses penalizes sites that are not absolutely perfect. If there are a few trees on the south side, if you plug those in properly, and if your house is relatively small, if you have a good view on the north, it can be really hard to meet the standard, borderline impossible. Whereas if you have a bigger house or better orientation, it can be easier to meet the standard.
Do you utilize solar, like passive solar energy techniques and natural ventilation, and does the program account for these things?
Yeah, well, so the pretty good house approach is really just a sort of loose set of guidelines. I think we describe it as a framework for considering the things that should be important when you're designing and building a house. So we don't have hard and fast rules, but absolutely we want people to take advantage of solar gains, much like passive house takes advantage of solar gains, but it's not like the passive solar houses of the strip and they're like all glass on the south. Like that's not good design, because windows, even the best windows available, operate like at nighttime. A really good window might be like an R4 or R5 wall. So it's a pretty bad wall. So it's good in the daytime when you're collecting heat if it's cold out, but just you have to use an appropriate amount of glazing. So like I like the PHPP Passive House Energy Modeling Program for helping fine tune glazing specs. I also use B-Opt, which is a free download from the Department of Energy. It's much quicker and easier than the PHPP. Like the PHPP takes hours to do, and I can do a B-Opt in an hour and a half. And it's much less precise, but it's a good way to sort of get some quick ballpark ideas of okay, if I have a high solar heat gain glazing or a low solar heat gain, you can sort of plug in options and see the results pretty quickly, enough to make a reasonably informed decision. But if you want more precision, there are more comprehensive energy programs.
So I read articles about the use of passive house certification or program for affordable housing. I don't know if you have any idea about that, and how can it be useful for affordable housing? What's the difference between using the program for single family and for affordable housing?
Yeah, I guess I don't have much firsthand experience with affordable housing, other than every project I've ever designed is more expensive than my clients want to spend. So we're always trying to make the home more affordable, but it's still far above what most people would consider affordable housing. I think the Passive House program, when it comes to single families, I mean, let me back up. This is kind of a controversial statement, but my opinion is that living in a single family house is a luxury. Most people in the world live in multifamilies of some sort. Like to have your own house on your own independent lot, like that in itself is a luxury, regardless of the quality of the house. And when you start adding layers of energy efficiency, like with Passive House, it pushes the cost up. Just there are ways, there's sort of trade-offs you can do. You can use less expensive materials. You can do things like in a passive house. We'll often go with like exposed concrete slabs for the floor because it's the least expensive way to get a decent floor. There are things we can do, and we might not do interior trim on the windows, like it might just be drywall returns. There's a huge swing in the cost of windows. You know, you can get a very good UPVC triple glazed window for less than you would pay for an American brand of a normal window, like a mid-range Marvin. You can buy a European UPVC triple glazed tilt turn for the same price. So there are those trade-offs, but it costs more to build a passive house. Just there more stuff goes into it, more time goes into it. I don't know, like unless you were mass producing them. I guess if you were mass producing them, you could probably get the cost down. Where I think passive house is a really good fit for affordable housing is with multifamilies, which I don't have firsthand experience with, but I have lots of colleagues who do high performance multifamilies. And that's kind of a no-brainer because you don't have the same, or let me back up. The main reason there's a penalty in passive house for designing a small house is your floor to surface area ratio isn't very good. For every square foot of floor, you have, you know, X amount of walls and roof and things exposed to the cold outdoors. So you're increasing heat loss, energy loss. With the bigger house, you actually have, there's less exterior surface for every square foot of interior surface. So you actually improve the relative performance per square foot, which is kind of backwards, but just that's the way the physics works. With a multifamily, you know, you usually have, or there's always at least one wall or floor that's shared with your neighbors. So if you're in the middle of a 20 unit and you have neighbors on two sides and up and top and bottom, and you're only exposed to the outdoors on one or two walls, like your heat loss for that unit is really minimal. So to get from a code minimum building standard to a passive house standard is not a big jump. Like you have to use like slightly better windows and put a little more attention into air sealing and make sure your ventilation equipment is high quality and not low quality. And you're pretty much there is what I understand. The downside, the trick that I hear from architect friends is that developers tend to be competitive about funny things. Just won't go for it unless they can see the economic savings, and the economic savings may or may not be there, but they often are there. Just you have to look out more than like the immediate return. Like it might take 5 years or 10 years to recoup that investment, but that's still a very good return on investment. You know, that's like a 10 to 20% return on investment is pretty good by stock market standards.
Awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, that's a really good return. So do you have an idea how much more expensive for a single family house would it be, like per square foot, let's say, or in general, more a passive house than a regular house? Yeah. I mean, it's because passive house isn't something like, it's not like interior decorating or structural engineering where you sort of just pass a layer over the design and like, boom, it's passive house. You really have to have passive house in mind from the start usually, and it usually impacts every decision from like what site do you choose to how is the building oriented on this site, and then is it a one-story ranch that's spread out? Is it a two-story farmhouse look? There are a lot of things like that make it hard to compare apples to apples. But I'd say if you were to, it might be easier to go in the other direction. Like if you had a perfect passive house, which is usually relatively boxy because corners are often thermal bridges, and they cost money. So if you have like a typical like two-story boxy passive house that has high levels of insulation, high levels of air sealing, high quality windows, a high quality balanced ventilation system, and relatively minimal heating needs. You can basically heat it with a candle. If you were to take that house and build it to code minimum standards, which would mean a pretty poor envelope, air tightness will be several times larger than the passive house. Windows will be commodity PVC windows probably. I think for
if you were to take an average, like the average American new house right now is around 2,500 square feet. So I would, a very rough estimate might be you could probably save $10,000 to $30,000 of initial cost if you were to build to less than passive house standards. So I guess that's the other way of saying that passive house might cost $10,000 to $30,000 more. Then there's also the design fees. If you're going for a certified passive house, then there's also the fees to have a passive house consultant on board, and then a passive house rater, and then the cost for certification, which might add another $10,000 to $15,000. So you can get those initial costs down if you go with code minimum, and if you weren't to change anything else. But the difference is that your energy costs are going to be, less than $1,000 a year for a passive house versus, say, maybe roughly $5,000 a year for a non-passive house. So you're paying, let's say, an average of, so if you're paying, say, an average of $20,000 more for a passive house, and that's a house that, like, around here, we'd be talking like a $600,000 to $700,000 house. So to spend an extra $20,000 or $30,000, like, that's still real money, but in terms of a percentage, it's not huge. And when you're getting a return on that investment of roughly $4,000 a year, it pays for itself quickly. It's actually a good investment.
So what are the advantages of getting certified? Do I get tax cuts? Do I get better market price when I want to sell? Why do I want to get a certificate?
I wish there were more market-driven reasons to get certified. It's always a hard discussion, and I don't know of any projects that were not at least partially, that certification was not at least partially paid for by the people on the design and construction teams. It tends to be, one thing it is a marketing tool for people like us who are trying to prove that we can design better houses. For clients, and for us on the design end, it's also, it's a lot of very smart people checking your work, both in theory, in terms of plans. Like, I mean, I design high performance houses almost exclusively, but I don't know everything. I only know what goes into the 20 projects a year I do. Whereas there are people who are looking at, 20 projects a week, and they see every way you can possibly do it. And they can say, change this, change this, change this, and you'll save X. And just that's hugely valuable. And there's also commissioning, which really every project should be commissioned, but most are not. Commissioning means having somebody qualified come and make sure your HVAC systems or heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and dehumidification systems are operated properly, that you're getting the proper flows at each of the termini. So that's something that every house should get. Most houses do not get, and so you get that sort of level of somebody who really knows what they're doing checking on your work. So you're really sort of, it's layers of assurance that you're getting the house that you think you're getting. You would think that would be true with every project, but very few projects perform quite how people expect them to perform, which is why, like, most heating systems are grossly oversized for the just in case factor. But when you grossly oversize a system, it costs more up front. It can short cycle and run less often than it should. If you're talking about air conditioning, you're not getting the dehumidification you need if you have an oversized system. So really, Passivhaus is sort of dialing things in to be like just exactly what you need and not a lot more.
Awesome. So at what stage your client starts to think about passive house in the process, before they buy the land, during the design process, and what do motivate them, or why do they decide to get a passive house certificate?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I should add, although I've gone through passive house certification for building assemblies for the manufacturer I used to work for, I personally have not actually gone through a residential certification yet. I have one in the works now that there's a good chance we'll go through FIAS certification, which is the American version of passive house. But I don't have the firsthand experience, and it's not for lack of trying. I've had a lot of people interested. and there are sort of two ways it happens. Some clients come to me, they know they want a good house that's energy efficient and that does not use up undue resources and it doesn't cost too much to operate and all those good green building things. And I'll ask if they've heard of Passivhaus, and they'll say, oh yeah, I grew up in a 1970s passive solar. And so then it's like, no, that's a different thing. Passivhaus is a terrible term for an awesome concept developed in Germany. It's not actually passive. It does require mechanical systems. It's not grossly overglazed. It's a very high performing home, or developed in Germany based on North American research, or worldwide. And some people jump on that, think it's a great idea. Others, the first thing they ask is how much it costs. And what else could they do? Other people come to me wanting a Passivhaus, like they've already researched it. They know I'm a Passivhaus consultant and designer, so I'm qualified to help them design this kind of house. And so then we'll go through the process of trying to get all of their needs on the land, which most of my clients already own their land. Once in a while, I'll get one out with the land. Usually people come to me with already land in hand. I don't work in developments in Maine. There aren't many developments. It's all custom design. So people will say they want a Passivhaus. They've researched it. We'll basically get to schematic design stage. I'll run a B-opt model because it's so much faster and easier than the Passivhaus model. And we'll see if usually we're not remotely in the ballpark. And we talk about ways we could get them in the ballpark. And usually those things are not things that they want to consider, such as buy a different lot or turn the house 180 degrees or eliminate half their windows or don't have windows that face the view, things like that are deal breakers. So at that stage, most of my clients say, what else can we do? And I say, well, there's this pretty good house approach. And I explain that and people like it. And so that's sort of a way we try to use Passivhaus for good, but use the pretty good house approach as sort of a more all-encompassing backup standard in terms of performance. I always use pretty good house principles, even when we do passive houses or close to passive houses, because it's a more holistic approach. But yeah, so I think that's those are the two ways it goes. I either try to talk them into it, or I end up talking them out of it.
Awesome. Now I'm going to be selfish, and I want you to tell us about the book that you're writing.
Yeah. So this pretty good house concept, like I said, developed about 10 years ago at a building science discussion group. And it had enough traction then, like that a few of us decided to try to write a book. So we had a bunch of meetings and came up with a table of contents, and then we all just got super busy, and 8 years flew by, and we haven't done a whole lot with it other than we all write occasional articles and follow the principles and talk about it, occasionally do presentations about it. But last year, just about 10 months ago, Taunton Press, who puts out Fine Homebuilding, Fine Woodworking, they do lots of books, including Sarah Susanka's Not So Big House series. They actually approached us to say, hey, with the pandemic, people are actually buying books again, and and with the UN IPCC reports on how dire our global warming, and people seem to be interested in this kind of idea, that this kind of thing. Would you think about writing a book that sort of just goes in depth on the pretty good house approach? I was already super busy with work, so I said, there's no way I can do it alone, but if I can ask people, then yes. So I asked Dan Clovert, whose idea it was, and moderates the discussion group there. I asked my friend Emily Martram, who's a high-performance architect here on the coast of Maine. And then I asked Chris Briley, who's a high-performance architect in Portland. Dan, Chris, and I were part of the original book team, so we added Emily, and we've been working on it since last December or so. And the idea is it'll be about 250 pages of with 12 chapters that sort of go through everything from like starting out thinking about economics and how do you select a team, which can be anything from owner, design, build to hiring out separate designers and builders or architects, and going through all of the really important things. It's not really a how-to book. Like you couldn't read this and know how to build a house, but but the idea is that you'll know what you should be asking or what your team should be asking you along the way to end up with a house that meets the pretty good house principles, which are really just good house principles. It's what every house should be, and reasonably energy efficient, made with materials that have a low environmental impact and that are very durable and that will be comfortable and safe for you to live in, and that's beautiful. Like that's actually one of our tenets that does not appear in passive house. And there are beautiful passive houses out there, but there are certainly some ugly passive houses out there. So part of the pretty good house approach is we say your house has to be beautiful, because if it's not beautiful, it won't be loved, and if it's not loved, it won't be maintained. Every house needs maintenance. So yeah, so that's
what's the name of the book?
I don't know if we have a name yet. I mean, it's really, I think the biggest discussion right now is whether or not we include the, so it's either the pretty good house or just pretty good house. I think we're currently leaning towards the pretty good house, and then the subtitle would be how to design and build a pretty good, or how to design and build a good house. That's sort of less on the authors and more on the editors. It's funny because I've written lots of articles. I'm used to most articles, the author only really does half the work. The editors do the other half of formatting and finding photos and doing all this stuff. So I think editors don't get the accolades they deserve for what they do for authors. Yeah.
Well, congratulations. I hope it will be a great success. I can't wait to buy it.
Thanks.
I'll reserve my copy.
Thank you. Yeah. We'll start. I think we'll start promoting it towards the end of this year, and it should be released early next year.
We just started promoting.
Yeah. There you go. Perfect. Yeah. So we have a website. It's just prettygoodhouse.org or prettygoodhouse.com. Either way, that sort of that has sort of quick synopsis of the 12 things that we think are important, and links to lots of articles and resources and companies that can help steer you in the right direction. Just a really big one is greenbuildingadvisor.com. It's a subsidiary of Taunton Press. It's a really good online community where they have daily blogs that are always topical, lots of stuff about Passive House, lots of stuff about Pretty Good House, and just everything that's important on the but it's all lumped under green, and green is kind of a corrupted term at this point. It's too bad, because when Green Building Advisor, it's really just, how do you design and build a house that is safe and healthy for the occupants, that doesn't cost too much, that doesn't cost more than it should to build, that'll last a long time, and that doesn't use more resources than it needs to.
Awesome, congratulations. Well,
Thanks.
Mike, thank you so much for doing this interview. I really appreciate it, and I'm positive that the viewers are going to appreciate it too. I'm looking forward
You're welcome.
buy the book. Thank you.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.